Hi, this is Rich Seiling, and this is part of my examples series for craftingphotographs.com, where we go behind the scenes and look in Photoshop at the tools I use to make this photograph and make the final print. This is a photograph I took around 1999 over in June Lake, California, where you get wonderful aspens and also these wonderful cottonwoods. And this is actually the second time I took this photograph. And that's important because we're going to look at some things today that this photograph is taking in open shade that puts a lot of blue light in. And the first time I took this photograph, I didn't have a warming filter on my camera, and it really made for a problematic piece of film that didn't capture everything that I wanted. And I had to go back and take it later once I learned what I'd done wrong. And what I'd done wrong is I didn't put a warming filter on it. So this is a 4 by 5 inch piece of transparency film. You can see it's Fuji Provia, and I like Provia a lot for its subtle color rendition. Velvia is a little too rich for me, and these greens and get a little nuclear and day glow for me with Velvia. I like Provia because I can really control it. And when I photograph, I'm looking to make photographic prints. That's my end result. So having this Provia as a starting point works really well because I can bump it up and make it have that rich saturation of Velvia if I want. But if I don't want it, it's not there. And trust me, it's a lot harder to pull that saturation out of Velvia than it is to add it back in here to something like Provia. Now, just a few more behind the scenes details. This is with 4 by 5 view camera, my Wisner, and this was with a 135 millimeter lens. Warming filter, I think, was probably an 81B on this. I don't keep careful notes on everything, so you'll just have to guess. It would have been an A or B because I didn't have a C around that time. And and again, when we're looking at this, remember that my end goal is a print, and what we see on screen, your screen is going to be calibrated or not, and how this video is going to come through with color accuracy may not show it. But I'm making adjustments that are based on what I want in a proof, and typically with feedback from making a hard proof where I've printed this photograph out. This particular photograph I print on Fuji Crystal Archive matte surface paper because I find it gives a really great color rendition, really great depth to everything, and just really represents what I want to say for it. So first, we're seeing here our finished product. This is after I've done all my work in Photoshop, and we have something that I think makes a very handsome photograph. But where it started out was a raw scan from the Tango drum scanner that looks something like this. We've got a pretty flat, gray, bluish tone, kind of ugly looking scan. And that's okay. This is a good starting point from the film. Um, what I try to do when I'm scanning is have my scans made by our scan master Jeff Grandy, and have it's the same philosophy we use at West Coast Imaging. It's to bring out all the detail in the film so we can work with it in Photoshop and not lose any uh, in the scanning process. And we're going to go from the bottom up here. We're going to skip this layer really quick, and we'll come back to that at the end because that's a final enhancement layer. Typically, this isn't exactly the order this got built in because I can bump around between all these layers over here as I'm building. But the first step that I do with most photographs is throw on a curve to try to get the contrast right, to try to get the highlight values where I want them and the shadow values where I want them. And with this particular first layer, this is the curve you see. It's a fairly simple S curve. I'm pulling the shadows down a little bit, and I'm lifting the highlights up. Now this is a good exposure out of the drum scanner, so I don't have to make moves like you'll see with a lot of digital cameras of moving the endpoints to try to adjust exposure. We've got a good exposure, so a curve of just lifting my highlight values is going to do much more pleasant things for this photograph. Now in the process of working through this, I added another curves layer, and you can see this curves layer just lightens this photograph a little bit. Let's look at that curve. Typically, I try to not do too much on one curve. I don't like throwing a lot of points on a curve. Just from lots of experience doing it, I've found it tends to make weird tonal relationships, and it's easy to get into trouble. So I really try to adhere to putting as few points on a curve as possible as a general philosophy. And so my previous curve, we dealt with contrast, setting our highlight and shadow values. If I want to lighten the photograph, I'm just going to start a separate curve, which is what this is. And you can see I just grabbed around the middle and lifted up a little bit. And when you do that, that's just going to lighten it up. If I move it down a little bit, that darkens it. I get a nice boost, and I don't do too much harm to the tonal relationships in that. Click cancel there. So that's what that curve does. Now we're getting to this point. I start off and I deal with contrast and density first, and then I move on to color balance. So let's skip over this dodging and burning layer, which probably came on later, and look at color balance. I'm looking at this photograph. My color analyzer is my brain. I don't use an automatic tool to tell me what the color should be. I'm looking at it and say, what's going on with this photograph? And I, what I see is some significant cast, a very blue cast that's deadening the reds. It's deadening the yellows. It's just kind of bringing a grayness overall to this photograph. Let's see what happens when we throw on some color balance. You can see here I've actually added a little cyan, I've added some magenta and added some yellow in an effort to warm this up. Actually, no, I take it back there. The cyan is 0. It looked like it had moved, so forgive me. So I've added magenta and yellow to move this up. And this is just to the midtones. I haven't done anything to the shadows or the highlights. The way I find color balance works really well, if I use the midtones, it acts a lot like a color enlarger used to in the darkroom, where I'm just adding some color overall. And by using the midtones, that gives me the best color overall. So that's where I can make these changes. And let's see what that actually does. So you can see that makes a pretty substantial change, and especially this yellow really works to deaden out the blue that was happening on these tree trunks. The magenta just brings a little bit more warmth back into this, and this is getting closer to what I want. It's looking pretty good actually right there. So the next thing that I'm going to look at is saturation, and I find that scans from film always can use a little boost in saturation, and what I see on screen um, isn't always representative of what I get on print, and adding a little bit usually gives it that extra zing it needs on paper to match what I'm seeing on screen. So in this case, we've just added +7, a very small amount of saturation. Let's turn that on. And you can see, let's zoom in on these leaves, just the richness it helps bring out there. Where there's still a little bit dead here before we add the saturation. The color balance is correct. Our problem is just it needs more color and more richness. And when we turn on that little bit of saturation, it gives us that boost that we need. And if we do the same thing down here in the reds, you can see we just get a little bit of boost. They're a little sleepy in there. But we get a little bit of boost. Now one last thing here that I've added on. Now we get to the fine tuning. We've gotten global changes. You can see this curve layer, this color balance, and this hue saturation. They're all global. They apply to the whole photograph, every area of it, not to just one particular area. And overall, it's looking pretty good. But it's time to start fine-tuning it a little bit and bringing out a little bit more from some areas that need local enhancement. And one of those areas was this foreground area down here in the front. And I've lightened that because it just seems a little bit dark and it just a little bit dead. And when I look at the photograph, what happens if I don't lighten it, my eye is pulled up into the top of the photograph, and the movement of my eye within the frame just kind of gets pulled to that top and then keeps on going and moves out of the photograph instead of lingering longer. And by opening up that area, it brings more life into the photograph in there and changes where my eye moves and keeps me in the photograph longer. This is a curves layer, and you can see again I've just used one point and done a little lift up here in the midtones. And let me show you here really quick what this is. This is a mask that I've basically painted in the areas that I want to be affected by this. I've used the brush tool and painted in white, starting with black, painting in white to get those areas that I want to be brought out to be brighter. And this is an intuitive process. I'm doing this in real time as I watch. Let's just make a quick change here on it. And if I want to bring lightness into an area, get a nice big brush, and I'm on this curve layer, anywhere I paint white onto that mask is going to bring in that lightening curve. If we watch over here, you can see right there, that's where I just painted, and it let through that curve layer to lighten that up. So that's all I've done here. Now in looking at this a little bit closer, we also have down in here, these reds are just a little cyan. That cyan component's killing the richness and the beauty of those reds. So what I've done there is taken a selective color layer, and take a look at that. See what happens by improving just those reds? What I've done is I've chosen red and I've added yellow to it to counteract the cyan, and I've subtracted, or to counteract the blue, and I've subtracted cyan as well. And just trying to warm that up, remove the blue and cyan cast that happened from this being taken in open shade. And I talked earlier about I took this with a warming filter. I probably could have gotten away with using one more step more of warming in this. Instead, I'm having to fix it here in Photoshop. And I can kind of move around one step of warming filter. Two gets a little bit harder. If it was no warming filter on this whatsoever, well then it'd be what this was the first time I took the photograph, which was something I couldn't correct into having this openness and beauty that I saw with my eye, but that the camera, because it was open shade, wanted to record all this blue in. So we've used this selective color, and selective color, what it does is just lets me pick one color and say, let me only do this to everything that's what you think is red in this photograph. So that's what we've done to bring that wonderful richness out. Let's look overall, and you can see just what that does to this photograph. It brings a great richness to my foreground and makes a nice contrast of the bright yellows above with this red below, and further enhances this eye movement that I'm trying to work to get my eye to move around and find lots of interesting things. Now one last part, you can see we've checked all our layers except this last one, and this is a last fine-tuning layer. There's still quite a bit of blue in this photograph that is just pulling at the full richness that this photograph could have. And let's see what this layer does before we talk about how we did it. See how by taking that blue out and making this just warmer, really more neutral, but I'm biasing a little bit towards the warmth, just what a rich photograph we get. And that's really representative of more what I saw with my eye. So let's look at what we did here. This is a color range mask. And what I did is I went in with the color range tool and I selected areas that were blue, particularly the trunks. Everything that's white here is selected, everything that's black isn't. So you can see the trunks are selected, the shadow areas all throughout this photograph are selected. Those are areas that are really going to pick up that blue bias. So I've taken these trunks, and with that color range mask, we've got them selected. And with them selected, what's going to happen is whatever I do on this layer with that mask is only going to apply to those selected areas. And what I've done is just a simple color balance. Nothing in the shadows, nothing in the highlights, just overall I've added in some red and I've added in some yellow, both of those to try to counteract that blue cyan bias that comes from the open shade that we've photographed this in. So similar theme to what we've been doing with other corrections, just applying it selectively to another area of the photograph that really changes the photograph as a whole. So that's behind the scenes on what I did to make this photograph and how it makes a beautiful print. Hope you've enjoyed this and learned more about Photoshop and my methodologies. We'll see you next time for our next examples. I'm Rich Seiling, and thank you for watching.